Boker Tov.
This meeting is being recorded.
Boker Tov, everyone. I actually was asked to give the shiur not long ago, and I'm quite pleased because I'm homesick this week with COVID. I've been home since Shabbat, so it's really good for me to I haven't left the house. I haven't given shiurim this week really in yeshiva, so for me this is a great opportunity to come to give some shiurim. So I would like to start with the topic that I chose to connect it to this week's parsha, but not only to this week's parsha, but rather I feel to a certain atmosphere that has been a result of COVID, and that is really the place of a shul in our communities. I'll start with if you can see your source sheet. I actually have a problem because I can't see the source sheet myself. I don't know what's going on. It's a bit different Zoom than I'm used to. For some reason, I don't know why I can't see my own source sheet. There must be something that I'm missing here. But if you look at this source sheet, and you'll see Rav Kook's, the second source, you see Rav Kook's Tshuva and Orach Mishpat. Rav Kook was referring in the year 1923, he was referring to shuls in America that stopped, that were interested in taking down the mechitza, if I'm not mistaken. He writes his Tshuva to America and Canada, and he was concerned with what he had heard, that shuls, Orthodox shuls, want to take down the mechitza. And he writes his whole letter about this, but in the introduction to his letter, he quotes this week's parsha, Parashat Balak, and he tells us, if you can, again, I'm sorry, I don't know why I can't see the source sheet in front of me right now, but I'll read from my own source sheet. You'll see that he quotes the Gemara in Brachot that says, "Lama nismechu ohalim lenechalim," right? In the bracha of Bilam, he compared the tents to the rivers, as he says, "Kinechalim itayu kiganot alei nahar keohalim natah Hashem lomar lecha ma nechalim ma'alim et adam mituma letahara af ohalim ma'alim et adam mikaf chova lekaf zchut." That Chazal teach us that the same way that the rivers, the water of the rivers, have the power to impure people, to move them from a matzav of tumah, matzav of tahara, so do the tents. And what are these tents? What are these tents that have the power to make people tahor, to impure people? These, of course, are the tents of Am Yisrael. Dalimudu mitzamich matovu alecha Yaakov, matovu alecha Yaakov ne'emar al batei knesiyot ubatei midrashot. The tents of Yaakov are not just regular tents. These are the tents of Am Yisrael in which we come to daven and we come to learn in. And the same way that the rivers have the potential to make people pure, so do the tents that we enter. The tents that we enter of B'tei Knesset, B'tei Midrash, have the power to make us pure. And if you want, it's almost like a game here with the word of ohel, because we know that usually the word ohel is in the association of tumah. There's a whole Masechet in Shas called Masechet Ohalot, which discusses tumat ohel. If someone comes into contact with a dead body within a tent, within a house, then they become tameh. That's the whole discussion about kohanim going into cemeteries and going into hospitals. So the word ohel many times is associated with tumah, and here the Chazal are teaching us that exactly the opposite. That there are certain ohalim that can perform the exact opposite. They can make tahara, and these, of course, are the ohalim of Batei Knesset and Batei Midrash. And I'm talking about this topic today not only because it's connected to this week's parsha of the bracha of Bilam, of Matovo Alecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael, but also I personally, and I think that everyone, many people probably agree with me, that there's a certain sense of that since COVID, there has been a huge, I would say, change in the Jewish community's approach to going to shul. I just in the past month have been to, I was in Chutzlaritz in South Africa and Australia, and I've spoken to different rabbis of different communities, and almost everywhere I've gone, people share with me that many communities are having very big difficulties to have the community return to shul and to daven, and some people got used to davening at home and got used to davening without a minyan, and some rabbis really are very concerned about the future, about how they're going to get people back into shuls, and they're trying all these methods of making all these kiddushes and who knows what to try to bring back people back to shul. So I do think this would be a good topic for all of us to think a little bit about the place of the shul in the Jewish community, and as I said, connected to this week's parsha. So let's try to understand a little bit what exactly is the kedusha of a shul, because we know that a shul has kedusha, and that a shul is, if you look in the source, Bitzal, is there any way you can help me see my own source sheet? I don't know why I can't see it. Can people see it on their?
No, I don't see it.
What?
I don't see it.
I can see.
Well, we see it, but we can't read it because it's too small.
Okay, so let me think. Let me try this again. Let me try this again. Now I turned it off. Now share screen. Hi Phil, how you doing? I'm just looking a second. Entire screen window.
You're clear on my screen.
There's a second. I don't know why I'm not. No, that's not what I want. I'm really sorry.
Now we see it.
But now you probably don't. 1 second.
Well, we saw it.
1 second. Oh, here we go. Window. No, I never had it before like this. That it didn't really. It didn't give me the option of sharing. Tov. I'll have to there without it right now. Okay, so let's start. Let's start understanding what the kedusha of the shul. There's a Zohar that the Zohar talks about kama chavivim batei knesiot. That why are shuls so chaviv? Because shuls, as we know, are batei mikdash me'at. There are certain similarities between the kedusha of a shul to the kedusha of a bet mikdash. I want to really question that. Is that just a machshava idea? Is that a nice idea? Or are there any halachic ramifications to comparing a shul to a mikdash me'at? So let's start with the Gemara Masechet Megillah. The Gemara Masechet Megillah, Daf Kav Daled, discusses different types of levels of kedusha associated with vessels. Okay, we use the term kedusha very, very easily many times to associate it with different feelings, emotions, and perhaps even vessels. But kedusha is a halachic term. Kedusha has halachic ramifications. If something is kadosh, then it means that there are certain ramifications to whatever is kadosh. So let's really understand when we talk about the Beit Mikdash, or in this case, the Beit Knesset, having kedusha. What does that really mean that there is kedusha in a Beit Knesset? So the Gemara Masechet Megillah tells us that there are two types of vessels when it comes to kedusha. The Gemara talks about tashmishei kedusha and about tashmishei mitzvah. What's the difference between tashmishei mitzvah and tashmishei kedusha? Tashmish means a vessel. Some vessels are for the purpose of a mitzvah, and some are for the purpose of kedusha. And the Gemara says that a shofar, a lulav, and tzitzit do not have kedusha in them, and when they are have a shofar has a hole in them, if a tzitzit has a tear in them, if you have to get rid of, they're worn out, you have to get rid of your tashmishay mitzvah, one is permitted to throw them in the garbage. However, tashmishay kedusha, the Gemara says, like tefillin, mezuzah, sefer Torah, have to be buried in the ground. The Gemara explains that not everything has kedusha. Not every vessel that you use for a mitzvah has kedusha. When do you have to bury something in the ground? Only when something has kedusha in it. Of course, the question is, what defines kedusha? How do you know what is tashmish mitzvah and what is tashmish kedusha? The answer is that anything that has Torah in it has kedusha. If something has a sefer Torah, like mezuzah, like tefillin, obviously a sefer Torah, then even if it's worn out, even if it can't be used, then it has to be buried in the ground, what we call geniza. However, any other types of vessels, clothes, horns, right, that we use for a mitzvah, like a shofar, like tzitzit, like a branch for lulav, when they are being used for the mitzvah, then it is correct to treat it with respect, with kavod. But there is no kedusha in tzitzit. There is no kedusha in a lulav. For example, we know that you're allowed to walk into the toilet with tzitzit. It is true that men have a minhag to take off their talit before they go into the toilet, and then someone always takes your talit and you miss it up, you know where it is. But that's only because it's not comfortable to take a talit into the bathroom. No one takes off their tzitzit when they go into the toilet. But tefillin, you're not allowed to take into the toilet because tefillin have kedusha. Tzitzit do not have kedusha. If tzitzit is torn, it's really nicer to throw it, to put it in a bag and not to put it with all the garbage. But halachically, you don't have to put tzitzit in gniza. A shofar that's broken, you don't have to put it in gniza. We have today, many people throw things in gniza today. And it's actually a very big problem in the Jewish communities today. The amount of books, of paper, of material people are putting in gniza. And it is probably correct to, some people have a minhag that they use their torn tzitzit as bookmarks, or people have a minhag to burn their lulav with chametz, right? I'm sure people have that, right? People have that minhag here to burn their lulav with chametz. So if I'm not mistaken, that minhag is just because it's a nice idea to do a mitzvah with another mitzvah. The lulav was a mitzvah, so burn the chametz, it's another mitzvah. But there's no halacha like that, and you're allowed to throw the lulav in the garbage theoretically. But mezuzah, you're not allowed to. Tefillin, you're not allowed to. They have kedusha. Torah has kedusha. I have in back of me here, and Rabbi here. Rav Shechter in an article in this book, Eretz Tzvi, has an article called Kedushat Knesset, and in it he explains that this idea, the idea that Torah has kedusha, is basically the principle of Knesset. I'll get that in a second. But before I say that, I just want to mention that this might be the deeper understanding why when a Jew dies, a Jew has to be buried in the ground too. Why do we say that Jews have to be buried in the ground? There's a Chalkut Rishonim whether or not a goy has to be buried in earth. So Ramban, Rashi, I'm not going to go into it right now, but we know that the halacha is that Jews must be buried in Ba'adama, basically geniza. What we do, I know it sounds terrible to say this, but the idea of geniza applies to Tashmishay Kedusha as it does to Jews. Why? Maybe we can say that every Jew is a Tashmish Kedusha. How can that be? What does that mean? The answer is that every Jew has a connection to Torah. We have this famous idea that there are 600,000 letters in the Torah, which of course is not true. right? It's a made-up number. But what's the idea of this number? The idea is to say that every Jew is a letter in the Torah. Every Jew has a connection to Torah. If that's really true, then every Jew, when he dies, is a Sefer Torah that has to be buried in the ground. I mentioned this once before. I don't know. I know because Phil is here, so I'm going to say this for Phil and for I could see Dr. Wolf is here. So they knew my father. So I don't know who else knew my father here. I'm sorry, I can't see everyone. But when the Gemara says that when a Sefer Torah is really destroyed and you can't use it anymore, so the Gemara says you should bury it with Talmid Chacham in the ground. You should bury it in the ground, but you should bury it with Talmid Chacham. So many years ago, I received a phone call from one of the directors of Camp Moshava, who told me that years ago he showed my Abba a Sefer Torah that was puzzle, and he asked my father's opinion what to do with it, and my father said to him that it's beyond repair, and you should just bury it one day with a Talmid Chacham. And that happened many years ago. And then I got a phone call a few years ago. My father was very sick from the director. I said to me, listen, is it okay? I want to bring the Sefer Torah to Eretz Yisrael. And after Mea Ve'esrim, I would like to bury it with your father. And on the day of my father's funeral, I received a phone call from him asking me if we can bury it with my father. And it didn't work out. I actually asked the chief. There's a big Talmid Chacham in Israel who is head of all the Chevra Kadisha in Israel, and he said that this is not really the minhag today, but to do this anymore, and it's a bit complicated because you have to bury it in a kli cheres, and it's a whole big thing. So we couldn't get it done from today to tomorrow, as if. But this idea of burying Sefer Torah, of burying Talmid Chachamim, but burying every Jew is connected to Torah. Every Jew is a letter in the Torah, and that's why we bury every Tashmish Kedusha in the ground. If that's really true, then we have to ask ourselves, what is the halachic status of a Beit Knesset? Is a Beit Knesset like tzitzit? Is a Beit Knesset like tefillin? Right? What level of Kedusha does a shul have? And the nafkamina is massive, meaning we have many halakhic questions today about what we can't and what we can do in a shul. From performing brises and bar mitzvahs and weddings, to having guest speakers, to eating and drinking in a shul, to selling a shul. L'tzarenu, in Eretz Yisrael, we had in Gush Katif questions about destroying shuls before giving them, before the Gush Katif story, which I'm not going to go into right now. Rav Moshe had shuvot about taking of a blind person, taking a eye-seeing dog into a shul. There are many taking a weapon into a gun is an old famous question. Meaning there are a lot of halachic questions that are very relevant and practical today about kedusha v'shul. That before we answer them, we have to ask, what is the halachic status of kedusha v'shul? And now we have two possibilities. It seems either we're going to compare it to a tzitzit and a shofar, which don't have kedusha, but we have to have respect at least to show some kind of kavod. Or alternatively, one could argue that maybe a shul has more than that. It's more of has kedusha. So this matter is actually a machloket rishonim between the Ramban and Ran in Masechet Megillah. The Rif in Masechet Megillah brings a machloket rishonim between the Ran and the Ramban. I'm going to try once more to. I'm going to try once more to put in, to choose what to share. 1 second. Maybe it'll allow me. 1 second. It's only allowing me to share my website, my internet. It won't allow me to share my article. I don't know why. My source sheet. Let me try one more. No, you can't see this, can you? You can't see this, no. Okay, sorry. I don't know what happened this time. Anyway, so the Ran and the Ramban argue the following. One says, the Ramban says that a shul is no less than a shofar, tzitzit. Meaning, when you use the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, it is obvious to everyone that you can't just take the shofar and throw it and use it for purposes that are not respectful, because it's a tashmish, it's a vessel that is used for a mitzvah. We have this idea with Nerot Chanukah, for example. Nerot Chanukah don't have kedusha, but we know the ein lanu reshut lishtamesh behem. We know that we're not supposed to use the Ner Chanukah for any other purpose, and the Gemara explains because it's bizui mitzvah. It's not respectful for the mitzvah that we're using for Chanukah candles to use it for other purposes. So obviously, says the Ramban, a shul, when it's being used, should not be used for other purposes because it's not kavod like any other mitzvah. Now, that's a nice idea, but you do understand that that's a very lenient opinion, because that means that, for example, when the shul is not used for davening anymore, let's say for some reason the shul needs to be sold or people have moved from the community, then that means, according to the Ramban, just like a shofar that has a hole in it or tzitzit that are torn, then the kedusha is gone, right? And it's just temporary for the tzorech hamitzvah, as to say. The Ran disagrees, and the Ran argues that a shul has kedusha midivreihem. The Ramban said, the Ran says, listen, I think it's not limited just to when you use the vessel for the mitzvah, but rather it's more like a mezuzah, that the kedusha remains forever in the vessel. You can't undo the kedusha of a tashmish kedusha, and such is the kedusha of a shul. And therefore, even when the davening is over, even when the shul is not being used for a shul anymore, the kedusha remains. But the Ran says midivreihem, midirabbanan, only rabbinical, because there's no real kedusha in a shul like Sefer Torah, like a mezuzah. But the Rabbanan made it. However, there is a third opinion. And this is the opinion of probably the Yereim, but more importantly, the Rambam. The Rambam, in Sefer HaMitzvot, in Mitzvah Samech Vav, the Rambam says, Samechei or Samech Vav, I'm not sure, I don't remember right now. I think, let me check. I apologize. But yeah, Samechei. The Rambam in Mitzvah Samechei, Mitzvah Aseh Samechei, talks about the idea of not destroying Makom Hamikdash. The Torah says in Parashat Re'eh that you have to destroy Avodah Zarah. And the Torah says, Lo ta'asun kein la'Hashem Elokeichem. You're not allowed to destroy anything to do with Beit HaMikdash. And the Rambam, when he writes down this mitzvah, he explains that there's an isur to destroy the Mikdash, the Mizbeach, and anyone who destroyed the Eichal, the Mizbeach, the Adumel Lezeh, Lokeh. It's a chiyuv malkot. However, the Rambam does not just refer this to the Beit Mikdash. The Rambam writes, "Shelo la'abed batei hamikdash o batei haknesiot o batei hamidrashot." Rabbi Soloveitchik pointed out that the Rambam includes in the lo ta'aseh of destroying the Mikdash, what's included is not to destroy a Beit Mikdash. That's a huge chiddush that we have not found neither in the Ramban or the Ran. The Rambam is saying that destroying a shul is the same level of destroying a Bet Mikdash. Meaning, when the Zohar that we read before and the Gemara say that a Beit Knesset is a Bet Mikdash Me'at, it's not just a vort. It's not just a beautiful idea that a shul functions as a small Bet Mikdash. According to the Rambam, a shul has a Kedusha the same level as if of a Bet Mikdash. That's a huge Kiddush. Where does the Rambam get this idea from? How can we really explain that a Bet Knesset has the Kedusha Mideoraita of a Bet Mikdash? Now you understand that the nafkamina of this is great. The nafkamina of this means that we have to be even more careful how we treat a Bet Knesset. I think I mentioned, I don't remember which year I gave to you to this community, but I once mentioned in some forum that Rav Lichtenstein and Rav Ariel argued amongst themselves about whether or not it's preferable for Tzahal to destroy the shuls of Gush Katif, or to allow the Palestinians are going to do it anyway. So is it better that we do it before, like in Yamit, Tzahal destroyed the shuls, if you remember. But in Gush Katif, they decided not to destroy the shuls, and the Palestinians destroyed the shuls. But the part of the machloket between Rav Ariel and Rav Lichtenstein was our question, right? How seriously do we take the Kedusha of a shul? The Rambam Shita, that a shul has Kedusha Mideoraita, would mean that we would be very hesitant to destroy a shul, even if it's for a purpose of not having the goyim desecrate the shul. But if we understand, like the Ramban and Ran, that with all due respect, Kedusha of a shul is only the Rabbanan, then it would be easier for us to destroy the shul. And that was one of the discussions and arguments that was between Rav Lichtenstein and Rav Ariel at the time. But going back to my question, how can the Rambam really hold that it's not just an idea that a shul is a Mikdash Me'at, but rather that a shul has Kedusha Mideoraita to some level? The answer to that is to understand the source of Kedusha, which we said before is Torah. We explained before that mezuzah and tefillin have Torah in them. And what does Beit Knesset have? Beit Knesset has a Torah. According to this, the Kedusha of a Beit Knesset is derived from the fact that the Sefer Torah in the shul. The Rambam explains that a shul is kadosh. It seems to be right in his words that the Kedusha of a shul is derived from the fact that we put a Sefer Torah in a shul. And that's what creates the Kedusha. I don't remember, I just given a few shurim in the past few weeks, but the Rabbi Soloveitchik develops this idea in a very beautiful way when he talks about Kedushat Eretz Yisrael. This is not our topic today, but I'll just say it really quickly, that the Gemara understands that Eretz Yisrael has Kedusha in it from the days of Yehoshua. And the days of Yehoshua, Am Yisrael made Eretz Yisrael Kadosh. The Rambam explains that the Kedusha was created by Kibush, conquering the land, b'milchama. And then the Rambam explains that the Kedusha was annulled and then returned in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, Kedusha Shniya. The Rambam explains that Kedusha Rishona was only for the Sha'ata and was batel, was annulled with the Churban Beit HaMikdash, and returned only in the days of Ezra. What is this Kedusha? So if we say that Kedusha is created by Torah, what Torah was in days of Yehoshua? The answer is that the wars of Israel, says Rav Soloveitchik, were always done with the Aron. The Torah says that the first vessel into battle was the Aron Kodesh, the Sefer Torah. What went into battle in Sefer Yehoshua and Sefer Shoftim? It's very clear that the Torah was in the battlefront. The first commandos were the ones who carried the Sefer Torah into Eretz Yisrael, which means, says Rav Soloveitchik, that basically what created Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael? The Torah. By bringing Torah into Eretz Yisrael, You created Kedusha. Kedushat Eretz Yisrael was created by Am Yisrael taking the Torah and entering Eretz Yisrael. And everywhere we went and conquered, we didn't just conquer. We took the Torah with us, as if we schlepped the Torah into every battlefield. And that Torah created the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. So Rav Soloveitchik was adamant that this idea that Torah is the only element that can create Kedusha is correct in Mezuzah, in Tefillin, in Kdushat Beit Knesset, and even in Kdushat Eretz Yisrael. And more than that, it's basically the source of Kedusha of the Beit Mikdash. Why is the Beit Mikdash Kadosh? Because the Aron with the Luchot HaBrit was in the Beit Mikdash. What created the Kedusha was the Kadosh Baruch Hu's house, was a house in where the Torah was put. That's what creates the Kedusha in this world. Kadosh Baruch Hu's Torah in this world is what creates Kedusha. And if that's really true, then the Beit Knesset has Kedusha because of the Sefer Torah that is munach in the Beit Knesset. So if that's really true, we have three shitot in the Rishonim whether or not a shul has Kedusha. The Ramban, who says it's just not real Kedusha, it's just like kavod, like any other mitzvah. The Ran, who says Kedusha midivrihem, and the Rambam, who holds that it's Kedusha de oraita. However, this is not so simple. And why is that? Because the Gemara Masechet Brachot teaches us that there are different halachot between the Kedusha of the Mikdash and the Kedusha of the Beit Knesset. Meaning, according to the Rambam, if what we said is true, we should find that the halachot of a shul and the halachot of Mikdash should be the same. If they're both Kadosh Midoraita, surely the way we treat both should be the same. And yet, the Gemara Masechet Brachot tells us, on Daf Samech Bet, Amud Bet, the Gemara tells us that there are certain halachot that apply to both, but certain halachot that do not. And I'll go through them. The Gemara says that you're not allowed to make a kapandria out of a shul. You're not allowed to use a shul as a shortcut, as you're not allowed to use a Bet Mikdash as a shortcut. Okay, makes sense. We have a halacha that it's parallel to both. However, the Gemara says that you're allowed to spit. Please don't take this literally, by the way, because in those days, they didn't invent the tissue yet. So if someone needed to sneeze, they would do it on the floor, which didn't have a real floor. I guess it had like it had sand on the, right? So it wasn't a real floor. But the Gemara says that you're allowed to sneeze on the floor of a shul, but you're not allowed to sneeze or spit on the floor of the Mikdash. Furthermore, I don't know if anyone here has gone up to Har HaBayit, but one of the halachot of Har HaBayit, as we know, is that you're not allowed to walk on Har HaBayit with your shoes. And yet, we all know that in Beit Knesset, you're allowed to wear shoes. And the Gemara asks this exact question. Why, when it comes to kapandria, to shortcuts, you compare them both, but when it comes to spitting and to wear shoes, they're different? And the Gemara answers the following. I'm reading the Gemara here. The Gemara says, Amarava, daf brachot daf samech gimel. Amarava, ki beito, ma kapandria, ma beito kapandria kapid inish, areki kamina lo kapid inish, av beit knesset kapandria hu de asur, rikika uminal shari. The Gemara says, because a shul is like your home. Whatever a person would be makpid to not to do in your home, you can't do in a shul. But if a person would allow it, would permit it, then you can do it. And the Gemara says, no one allows people to use their home as a shortcut, right? No one would allow people, if you live in a neighborhood where you live across the street or a bus stop, and people would benefit from walking through your living room to get to the bus stop, no one's going to allow that. So you can't use a shul as a shortcut. But apparently, people used to spit in their own homes on the floor. And as we know, people wear shoes in their homes. By the way, I know that there's some homes in Canada that people are not allowed to walk. I was in Australia now also, in a house where they didn't allow me to wear shoes in the house. I know that some people have this minhag, but not to wear shoes to get the house dirty, especially if they're rugs. But most people, I think, do permit people to walk around with shoes. So the Gemara says you're allowed to walk with shoes in the shul, because in people's homes you're allowed to walk around with shoes. What is Gemara saying? What's going on here? So Rabbi Soloveitchik, in one of his Yartzeit Shirim, explains this in the most beautiful way. The Rav says that on one hand, what we said is true. On one hand, we compared a shul to Bet Mikdash, and we said, according to the Rambam, that a shul has a certain level of kedusha like a Bet Mikdash. However, it's only like. It's not the same. Even if a shul has kedusha midoraita, it is a Bet Mikdash me'at. It's not the real thing. What's the real thing? Only Bet Mikdash. And what's the difference? Rabbi Soloveitchik explains, the difference is that the Bet Mikdash is the house of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Beit Knesset is the house of Am Yisrael. When we go to the Bet Mikdash, we are guests in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's home. And when you go to the home of the king, when you go to the palace of the king and queen, you have to show much more respect. If you were invited to Buckingham Palace, you're going to get a brand new suit. You get it even, you'll get it washed and cleaned, and you look like a mensch. In your own home, if you are entertaining a royal visitor, you'll also make sure your house is clean and tidy. But you're not going to have the same level of kavod if they come to your house. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes, when we daven in our shul, we are inviting HaKadosh Baruch Hu to come into our home. When we go to Beit HaMikdash, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is inviting him into his home. And that's what the Gemara is explaining. That's exactly what the Gemara is saying. Ki beito. The shul, said Rav Soloveitchik, is kedusha, is limited because it's at the end of the day our home in which we invite HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's what the Gemara says, by the way. The Gemara says in Brachot that when there's a minyan called for a certain time and people don't show up, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is upset. As it says, Madua karati bati ve'en ish, karati ve'en oneh. When we say HaKadosh Baruch Hu davening is at 7, HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to hear our davening. And if he comes and we're not there, he's upset because he came to minyan. He came to our house. Unlike Beit HaMikdash, when we go to his house. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, by the way, explains that this idea, he says, is very similar to the idea of Shabbat and Yom Tov. Rabbi Soloveitchik explains what is the difference between Kedushat Shabbat and Kedushat Yom Tov. Why is it that the halacha says that on Yom Tov we have to dress better than we would dress on Shabbat? The answer is because Yom Tov, we enter HaKadosh Baruch Hu's domain. We go to the Mikdash, Aliyah Yerushalayim, we go La'amod Lifnei Hashem. Shabbat, we go out into the field to receive the Shabbat that comes into our home. Kadosh Baruch Hu comes to our home on Shabbat, while on Yom Tov we go to his home. So this idea is the difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov is the same difference between Yom Tov, between a shul and a Bet Mikdash. So even if the main idea of the kedusha of a shul is derived from the Mikdash, it can't exactly be the same, explains Rabbi Soloveitchik. But let's go a little bit deeper into this. If what we're saying is true, that the kedusha of a shul is derived from the Bet HaMikdash, I want to try to understand this a little bit better. Because what does it really mean? How far do we take this idea? And I would like to argue that we take this idea very, very far, as I'll soon try to prove it. The Gemara Masechet Brachot Daf Kavav, very famous Gemara, explains that tefillah, the idea of davening 3 times a day, can either be established on the Avot, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, daven Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv, or on Korbanot, Korban Tamid Shel Shachar, Korban Tamid Ben Arbaim, and all the leftovers at night that would burn on the Mizbeach is why we daven Mariv. And this is the machloket in the Gemara. Is this a real machloket? Is this a machloket with halachic ramifications, or is it just a machshava machloket? I want to claim that it's more than just a machshava machloket, and it serves as halacha. It has halachic ramifications. How we understand tefillah, and why is that? Because take musaf. Musaf only makes sense if we model tefillah for korbanot. The Gemara says that Mariv is optional. Mariv being optional only makes sense if we model tefillah for korbanot. The times of tefillah. Why do we daven until the 4th hour of the day? Why the Gemara in Masechet Brachot in the 4th parak discusses, the first Mishnah discusses different times of tefillah. They are all modeled on the zmanim of the korbanot. The whole idea of tashlumin, the idea that if we miss shachris or mincha marv, we can fix it with tashlumin, is taken from the korbanot. Tashlumin of korbanot, meaning these are not just nice ideas that tefillah is because of a korban, but rather this comparison, this model of tefillah and korbanot creates certain halachic ramifications. What am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that when Chachamim created tefillah as we know it today, I believe that they modeled the whole idea of tefillah for korban in Beit HaMikdash. Meaning, if the whole idea of a korban, of tefillah is to model a korban, then it makes more sense why the tefillah is in a Beit Knesset, because a Beit Knesset is a Beit Mikdash. When Chazal created the Beit Knesset, they tried so hard to copy the Beit Mikdash in so many different ways. Right? Let's start with the idea of a bima. Why do we have a bima in a shul? To read from the Torah. The bima serves as a mizbeach. And where do I get that from? I'm sure people know that there was a very famous argument in Europe about moving the bima in a shul. The Reform movement had this idea of moving the bima forward. And many poskim, like the Netziv and others, were very upset about moving the bima. And they were upset about this, the Chatam Sofer and others, because they felt that this was trying to build the shul in the same model of a church. And the Reform were trying to copy the churches by moving different vessels within a shul. And this really created a huge argument within the Jewish community, even though, by the way, the Rambam says that there's no problem moving a bima, because there really is no problem moving a bima. But once it became the symbol of the Reform, then it became a big problem. However, the Chatam Sofer said, and the Netziv said, that it's not only because of the Reform, it's because that a bima is a mizbeach. And he said, you have to be able to, when we take a lulav today on Sukkot and walk around the bima, it's because we are imitating the mizbeach in the Beit HaMikdash, where they used to walk around it with a lulav. And therefore, if you can't dance around the mizbeach, around the bima, says the Chatam Sofer, then you have a problem, because it's supposed to be like the Beit HaMikdash. So this is not just an idea, but rather a halacha that you have to be able to walk around the bima. By the way, this is true also about the bracha of a gomel. When do we make a gomel? The halacha is that you make a gomel when you get an aliyah to the Torah. Why? Because a gomel is supposed to be a zecher le korban toda, which is a korban at the mizbeach. So when do you say a gomel? Say the achronim. You say it when you're at the bima. So you're supposed to imitate bringing a korban toda to the Beis Hamikdash, making a gomel on the mizbeach in the Beit Knesset. Let's talk about more things. The Aron Kodesh, of course, and the Sefer Torah, the Ner Tamid, the Ezrat Nashim. Where is this idea taken from? Ezrat Nashim. The only place that we have a halacha that you're supposed to have an Ezrat Nashim is in the Beit Knesset. Now, I don't want to, I know I'm being taped and people are listening to me right now, so I have to be very, very careful. But it is very interesting that Shulchan Aruch doesn't mention that you have to have a mechitza in a shul. It's not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch or in the Ramah. Don't worry, I'm not trying to make an argument right now, but it is fascinating that the discussion of the height of a mechitza only occurs in the 20th century. Only then is there the machlokes between Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Satmar Rav, the Sri Daesh, have a whole discussion how high the mechitza has to be. Why wasn't this discussed in the 19th century, in the 18th century, in the 17th century? Because you can all guess why it wasn't discussed, but the fact was it wasn't discussed until then. But the Gemara Masechet Sukkah talks about having a mechitza in the Beit Mikdash. Takana Gdola asu, that they separate between men and women. So when the shuls became shuls, when the idea of a shul became, they invented the idea of a shul, and the shul is supposed to replace the Beit Mikdash. So the same way there was a chalukah distinction between men and women in the Beit Mikdash, so was established in the shul. It's fascinating. It's fascinating because it's almost like an historical thing rather than a halacha. That when they build a shul, they replaced the Beit Mikdash. And the same way the Beit Mikdash had a bima, an Aron Kodesh, and a Ner Tamid, and a mechitza, so do shuls have a mechitza. I think it's a very interesting idea of mechitza, but I'm going to put that on the side right now and go back to what we just said before. What about a Kohen? Who replaces the Kohen today? The Chazan. The Chazan today replaces the Kohen. I'll say more than that. We have Shmoneh Esrei b'Yachid and Shmoneh Esrei b'Tzibur, B'Lachash and the Chazan. Why two? It would seem you can argue that the Rambam says it's because the people didn't know. The Gemara says people didn't know by heart. They didn't know Tefillah, so we had to do it for them. But it could also be because one is a Korban Yachid and one is a Korban Tzibur. Meaning there are so many comparisons between what we do in a shul to what we did in the Mikdash. And finally, when we daven in a shul today, the shul must always face the Beis Hamikdash. Because when a person is davening in any shul in the world, they must imagine that they are now in the Beis Hamikdash sacrificing a korban. So you must mechaven, you must stand with a direction towards not Yerushalayim, but rather towards the Beit HaMikdash. Have in your mind that you are now sacrificing a korban in the Beit Mikdash. So every shul in the world is a mikdash me'at. When you enter a shul in Chutz La'aretz or even in Israel, what you're basically entering is an embassy, as if, of the Beit Mikdash. And that was the idea that Chazal did when they created, I think, the shul, and when they created the halachot. The Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tzadik Zayin in Orach Chaim says, Hatfilah hi bimkom korban. Shulchan Aruch paskins, he rules. Tefillah is because of a korban. And therefore, he says, you have to stand in a makom kavua, like a korban needs a makom kavua. You must dress appropriately because when you give a korban, you're supposed to dress appropriately. And you're supposed to do this and supposed to do that. Meaning, Shulchan Aruch says it's not just a machshava idea, but rather the halachot of tefillah are all taken from this idea of being in the Bet Mikdash. So to conclude, what we learned until now is that we discussed the kedusha. The idea of kedusha, halacha kedusha, we said is derived usually from a Sefer Torah. We said that a shul, whether or not it has kedusha, is a machloket rishonim between the Ramban, Ran, and the Rambam, and that the Rambam holds it has kedusha similar to Bet Hamikdash, a kedusha mideoraita. Even if we explain that it can't be exactly the same level of Bet Mikdash, it still has some kind of level of kedusha. And that kedusha, we said, is derived from the fact that the Sefer Torah is in a Beit Knesset. And we said furthermore that Chazal tried very much to create a halachot and in order for us to imagine that what a shul basically is, it's a mikdash me'at. And then when we enter a shul, we should feel that we're entering the mikdash and sacrificing a korban, and we're standing before Hashem when we go into a shul. I can see it's a bit late because I have here with me, I have a whole list of tshuvot, which I thought of going through, which I'm not going to right now, about taking neshek into a shul, taking an eye-seeing dog into a shul, eating and drinking into a shul. A lot of these halachot, there's a tshuva of the Three De'esh, by the way. The Three De'esh has a very upsetting tshuva that he wrote during the Holocaust in the beginning, when the Nazis came into power before the Holocaust started. But in the 1930s, he lived in Germany, and they closed all, in the beginning, Jews weren't allowed to assemble anywhere. The only place in the beginning they were allowed to assemble was in a shul. And the question was whether or not you're allowed to perform a concert in a shul. And the Three De'esh goes through it's a long tshuva in which he discusses the kedusha of a shul when it comes to that, to eating, drinking, to doing other. And I'm not going to go into it right now, but you probably know that in Chutz La'aretz, and with that I'll finish. With that I'll end for today. In Chutz La'aretz, we're more lenient about kedusha of a shul. In Chutz La'aretz, we're more lenient about using shuls for other purposes than we are in Israel, because the Gemara says that all shuls in Chutz La'aretz are built on a t'nai. That one day, atidin batei knisiyot shebebavel, in the future, to make aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, no shuls in Chutz La'aretz were ever built b'kviut. They were all built with a condition, with a t'nai, that at what point they're going to be taken apart and moved to Eretz Yisrael. But the shuls in Eretz Yisrael have kviut in them. So and therefore when you build a shul in Eretz Yisrael, the kedusha remains forever and cannot be annulled, unlike kedusha of Beit Knesset and Chutz La'aretz. And that itself, by the way, again brings us back to the Bet Mikdash, because the Rambam paskins that the kedusha of a Bet Mikdash remains forever. The reason why we can't go up to certain parts of Har HaBayit today is, according to the Rambam, the Aviad disagrees, but the Rambam holds that the kedusha of the Mikdash remains forever. Vashimoti ani et Mikdashchem. The Gemara says that that even after the desolation of the Beit HaMikdash, b'kedushatam hem omdim, the kedusha is still there. And if you really compare a Beit Knesset to a Beit Mikdash, like we just did, then it would make sense why the kedusha of Batei Knesiyot Shev Eretz Yisrael, their kedusha remains forever, even if Chas v'Shalom they're destroyed. The kedusha is still in them and remains forever in these shuls. Tov, Ad Kan. If anyone has any questions or remarks, this is the time, please, to Vakasha, to speak up. Yes, Phil, Vakasha.
The mechitza business. Are we going on the basis that there's a period of time when women were allowed? Was there a period of time when women were allowed in the Beit HaMikdash on the ground floor, but in different areas?
Yeah, the Gemara says that the Gemara in Sukkah says Takana Gdola Asu, in Simchas B'Sas Shoeva, the Gemara said at the beginning they separated men and women. The women were outside, the men were inside, the men were inside, the women were outside, and then they decided to take the women up a floor and build a mechitza, mamash, like we have today.
Right.
So I guess there was a time when they were mixed, and then they were separated, and then they tried different solutions, the Gemara says, until they invented the idea of having a full separation on a different floor. That's what the Gemara says. We in Jewish history, this developed into separation also in the shul. But I am not aware of any real source that says that, an older source that says that a shul has to have a mechitza. That's just the minhag of Am Yisrael. And the minhag, like I explained, is based upon the idea that a shul is a replica of the Beit Mikdash.
I wanted to I went on a trip to Uzbekistan, and we spent a Shabbat in Bukhara. In Bukhara, you have to take your shoes off before you go into shul. So I laughed. And then they said, first of all, in the homes, you don't take your shoes, you leave your shoes outside before you go. But I made a joke. I said, that's because you've got expensive Persian carpets here, and they didn't want people to make them dirty. So, but I never thought, but the Gabbai said, no, even in the Bet HaMikdash, you wear shoes. Alachat kama v'kama in a shul. That's what the Gabbai said there.
Yeah, that's not true. Yeah, thank you.
All had to take out. All the men took their shoes off for minhag.
That's interesting. Thank you for that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Beseder, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everyone. Kol tuv.